Let's talk about collaboration. I'm delighted to be joined now by Dr. Nicola Millard, Principal Innovation Partner at BT, to delve a little deeper into the future of collaboration and the workplace, wherever that may be. Dr. Nicola, how lovely to see you again. Whereabouts are you joining us from today in your blue studio? I like it.
Oh yes, you know, it's a lovely colour, isn't it? No, I'm actually in lovely sunny Suffolk. I'm in Ipswich at the moment, which is of course not far from where I'm normally based, which is at Astral Park, our main research and innovation headquarters. It's about 7 miles away from me at the moment. So yeah, Ipswich is where I am.
Terrific. Well, lovely to see you today, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join in. And perhaps for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of watching you or hearing you speak at an event, as I have done many times, just explain for us your role at BT, because it's, I think anyway, I'm biased, it's a really interesting one.
It is an interesting role, and I did used to have the bizarre title of futurologist, which
Yes.
either sadly or joyously, I am no longer the owner of that ridiculous job title, because everyone always used to ask me, do I have a crystal ball? And although I do, it doesn't work, sadly. No, I actually work for Fotis, who you heard from earlier. I'm part of a small but beautifully formed innovation team under Fotis. So our role largely, or Fotis actually already talked about some of the things that we've been doing. Around some of the healthcare, for example. Some of the team do that. I am the slightly weird member of the team that looks at people. I'm a psychologist by background, so basically my role is to look at the most disruptive part of innovation, I always claim, which is of course not necessarily the technology. The comment earlier around, well, the technology would already, I mean, we could work from home for, well, some people in BT have been working from home for 20 years or more. So we know the technology works, but it's actually a lot of the culture change and the expectation and the anchors back to the traditional workplace that have stopped us maybe from doing it until we get a massive virus pandemic that means that we have to think really, really innovatively in order to stay working. So yeah, it's a very good example of how people actually energize change rather than necessarily the technology alone.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because you're right. You've been an advocate that I can see, a champion of collaboration for such a long time. So this must have been, obviously, notwithstanding the fact that horrible things are happening and all over the world, all of that. But with regards to the workplace and our work, it must have been really exciting and interesting to see how people have been adjusting to embracing and using the collaboration tools that, like you say, have been around for 10, 20, maybe 30 years in terms of video conferencing.
Yeah, I remember I've been reminiscing a lot lately, and I've been with BT for a very long time, longer than I would care to admit maybe, but I remember back in 1992 we ran our first homeworking trials, and we did incorporate things like video conferencing in there, even though the actual video conference units were the size of a small fridge. But I think we always understood that remote working, there was an anxiety. I was on the team just as a minor part of the team, looking at the well-being of the people actually in that trial, because they worked from home for a whole year, and we weren't sure, you know, whether they would become very lonely, and they didn't, by the way. And actually, the trial was a huge success. It was before broadband, and we had to dig people's front gardens up in order to get a massive pipe into their house, and therefore it was quite expensive. So, I mean, I've been studying homeworking and obviously the future of work for quite a long time, probably 10, 15 years. And it's been absolutely fascinating, because this pandemic has forced us into really trying to rethink the way that we work and collaborate. And I think there's always been a tension, we've called it the collaboration conundrum, around the fact that distance almost acts against people collaborating, which is why, you know, when we look at office spaces, actually MIT Innovation Partners did a fantastic study back in the 70s where they looked at, you know, the effect of proximity on collaboration. And sure enough, they found out something called the Allen curve. They found out that the further away you were from somebody, the less likely you were to collaborate with them. But the problem there is, and we can see it from the office designs we did have, was you pack more and more people into smaller and smaller spaces and then assume they're going to collaborate. And that isn't always the case, because what we have learnt is that collaboration does not happen by magic. What actually it needs is purpose. And that can be lacking in a physical situation as much as anything else. And I think by studying remote teams, and we have been doing that for a long time now, we know that actually remote teams do need a purpose to connect and collaborate. They need the right tools to connect and collaborate. And actually, there's no lack of tools out there, and that can be a problem as well, because we have too many. I think at one point I worked out I had 13 different collaboration tools in BT, and that doesn't necessarily help me to collaborate. It can overwhelm me, but I think, again, the leadership challenge here, and it is mostly a leadership challenge, is around firstly creating that purpose for collaboration, but secondly actually creating common ground for collaboration. And up until recently, that common ground could have been the office, because the office maybe isn't a good collaboration tool now, but it was a good collaboration tool. But actually, there are lots of virtual tools as well that will do this. So when I say common ground, it has to be accessible to everybody, and it has to be fit for purpose. And again, it's a leadership decision around, well, what is the right tool for the team that I'm working with, the tasks that they're doing. So I think there's a really interesting, I've called the dynamic in an office is quite often lazy, because if you see people, you assume they're talking to each other, you assume they're working. Actually, as you go more and more virtual, it does test some of the culture and tests the work styles and tests the leadership styles that we need to make this work.
Fascinating. So much there to unpack. One thing I want to draw up was an observation I was making a couple of days ago. And you talk about this purpose behind collaboration. Now, something that I've observed in how we've been using video conferencing over the last few weeks or so is and the difference between that and being in an office. In an office, there's lots of ephemeral conversations that just happen. You just happen to hear someone sat behind you talking about a thing, and you happen to be working on that same thing, and you're then able to collaborate. That if you're making a purposeful conversation, saying, right, I'm going to put a meeting in the diary for 10 to 10:30, and let's talk about that thing, you do lose a lot of those accidentally overheard conversations. And I guess that's one argument against the remote working kind of deliberate video conference conversations that we have. But I want to counterpoint that with how my children use video conferencing, or have been, with their friends. And apart from the defined kind of lesson things, when they're just FaceTiming, other video conference tools are available, but when they're just FaceTiming, they will call and then they'll just leave the phone there on the side and go about their normal day and, say, what are you doing? I'll say, oh, I'm chatting with so-and-so, but you're not near the phone. You're doing something else. Oh, yeah, but, we're just kind of hanging out. That is something that I've not witnessed yet in my experiences with collaboration, certainly over the last couple of months. That just hanging out kind of collaboration that I think might bring us back a little bit to those ephemeral conversations that maybe we've been missing by not being in the same space.
Yeah, I mean, we did do some experiments, particularly with some of our agile teams at Astral, because a lot of the teams are distributed around in multiple software development centers. They did look at persistent video walls, but to be honest, people didn't really look at them very often. But I did see there's some fantastic innovations going on, but I did see one, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was effectively like a blind. So you could have persistent video and see people whenever you wanted, but you could also sort of say, I'm open or I'm closed. So you could lift the blind if you wanted to connect with people and take the blind back down if you didn't. I thought that was a beautiful design idea. Now, again, whether it would work or not, I don't know. And particularly, I mean, my observation would be at the moment that because that was always a split between either different virtual sites or a split between a virtual site and maybe a remote team who was maybe working from home. I think one of the lessons we've learned from this massive global experiment is actually when everyone is remote and everyone is in the same situation, actually we tend to collaborate better. And I think then is when you are trying to collaborate with somebody in an office space, and then you've got various people dialing in. Again, I'm using the word dialing in over video, and that can be a struggle because I guess out of sight sometimes is out of mind. So I think we're again learning a little bit about the dynamics of this, and whether that's, you know, having a persistent video window open. We are, I mean, video is incredible. We say that you know, you know when you've arrived, when you've become a verb, and Zoom, wow, you know, they have now become a verb. So we're living our lives on all sorts of video platforms at the moment. But you know, I think there are other collaboration tools that almost reintroduce the serendipity, and I would say enterprise social media has become very interesting. Previously to COVID, no one really knew what those tools were for. So I again, no purpose. Now what I'm seeing, certainly within BT and a number of the other organizations I've been working with, is seeing that enterprise social media has become more than cat photos and senior managers taking photos of meetings. It is actually people sharing ideas and sharing what they're doing and asking people, you know, have you experienced this? And that actually is trying to reintroduce that serendipitous conversation and connect people in a slightly different way.
Platforms like Teams and like Slack and those kind of chat and social media-ish kind of collaboration platforms.
That's right. I mean, we've got Teams and Workplace and Yammer and all sorts of things that we can connect on. And then obviously there's the external ones as well, like Twitter and LinkedIn, which I'm using very extensively at the moment just to connect with people outside the organization as well. Add that with things like virtual coffees and pub quizzes seem to be the thing at the moment amongst teams to actually just build some of that informal stuff is incredibly valuable. I know our team, the pub is called The Locked In, but you start to get to know, I mean, our team's very remote anyway. We're very distributed, and probably we're meeting more than we would have done previously, and actually interacting much more than we would previously, because we were remote and a lot of us were running around the country and very busy, and we're still very busy, but we're finding time to sort of connect and get to know each other in a slightly different way.
Indeed. There's so many more things I want to talk about, but I'm conscious of our running out of time. But I do want to ask you one question about the technologies that we maybe haven't seen yet, that maybe 5 or 6 years ago we might have expected to be part of this mix, had we anticipated it. Things like virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. You know, these have always been the dream, the vision of how in the future we would collaborate a little bit more immersively. But I don't get the impression, at least in the mainstream, that we have seen those yet. So what's your assessment on where we are and maybe what needs to happen in order for them to become more universal as collaboration platforms?
Yeah, well, I'm not the biggest fan of virtual reality, I must confess. I've always been a tiny bit cynical about it. I call it vomity reality because those headsets really don't work with me. And also the problem is those headsets. So I don't want to spend 7 hours a day immersed in a headset because that's going to be, I suspect, a little bit disorienting. So I think VR definitely has a role. Certainly, we've been looking at things like virtual education with it. But I think actually augmented reality is starting to grow. I did notice Apple have just had a leak around their new glasses, their augmented reality glasses. And I think the good thing about that is it doesn't make you look as stupid as Google Glass did, because they just look like an ordinary pair of glasses. So we'll see. But I think we are certainly, Fotis talked earlier about some of the healthcare stuff that we've been doing. So having a paramedic with an augmented reality headset in an ambulance, treating a patient with a doctor remote with a virtual reality headset, able to then talk the paramedic through the procedure. And then hopefully you get a much more seamless interaction at the hospital. That works. The other big growth one that we've seen is use of, well, it's not necessarily augmented reality, but remote diagnostic tools. So there's one that we use in our BT consumer division called Site Call, where you can literally, with the customer's permission, take control of the mobile and even the lights. So if you're having internet broadband problems, we can say to the customer, can you just show us what you've got plugged in? So we've got a remote agent, a remote engineer, actually talking customers through a process. We've even done things like pattern recognition and automatic labeling, because these are all standard wires. We can actually just use AI to say this wire goes in this slot, because we can recognize using pattern recognition what goes where. So we can help the customer without the need for an engineer to actually go into a house, which at the moment is very desirable.
Yes, I think I saw when BT launched that last year or year before or so. I haven't had an opportunity to use it, but really interesting stuff. I'm afraid we're almost out of time, but I am going to push the schedule to ask just one final, very quick question, very quick answer as well, please, about collaboration, again, for leaders from across many large organizations watching today. In terms of continuing to foster collaboration, is there one tip that you would be happy to share with where we are at the moment and where we think we might be over the next 6 months or so?
Very quickly, I think I've already answered it. It's kind of leaders need to be less about I can see people, therefore I'm going to assume they're working. Command and control leadership by seeing people sitting at seats. More into a much more purpose-based understanding of who their teams are, a sort of more lean-in approach, creating purpose, creating connection, creating that common ground. So yeah, that would be my final message.
Terrific. Dr. Nicola, as always, a delight to catch up with you. Do stick around for the Q&A later on. And if you do have any questions around what Dr. Nicola has just been speaking about, pop them into the chat and we'll address them in just a few minutes' time before we wrap today. But for now, Dr. Nicola, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right, we have been asking you to share your views on our latest poll. The results are in on my screen over here. So we've been asking you, is long-term working from home policy going to be more of a priority for your business as a result of the coronavirus? The poll results, yes, according to 89% of you, no, 8%, and we haven't discussed yet 2%. So yeah, certainly working from home policy going to be more of a thing as a result of coronavirus. Yeah, overwhelming majority think that the tide certainly does appear to have turned.